lot of his early films, like Fury, which was a very fine film. I don't know if you remember it.
It was the kind of love affair that seemed ripped straight from a Hollywood script, intoxicating, irresistible, and ultimately destructive. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton weren't just stars. They were constellations in the golden sky of cinema, two of the most magnetic personalities the world had ever seen. And when they collided, the explosion was unlike anything Hollywood or the world had witnessed before. Theirs was not a quiet romance tucked away from curious eye. No. Elizabeth and Richard's love was scandal in Technicolor. It unfolded in public, blazing across magazine covers, whispered about at glamorous cocktail parties, and splashed in bold headlines across newspapers around the globe. Their passion was a spectacle, and audiences devoured every detail. The stolen glances, the heated arguments, the diamonds that sparkled like trophies of conquest. But beneath the allure, there was chaos. Elizabeth was already a Hollywood legend by the time she met Richard, twice married, twice divorced, with a reputation for both beauty and defiance. Richard, the brooding Welsh actor with a voice like thunder and a taste for whiskey, was equally formidable. Together, they were unstoppable, yet completely unstable. Their story began on the set of Cleopatra, a film infamous not only for its astronomical budget, but for the illicit romance it birthed. Both were married to other people, and their on-set affair became an international scandal, condemned by the Vatican and denounced as an outrage to morality. But that condemnation only added fuel to the fire. Hollywood scandals had erupted before, but nothing compared to the storm Elizabeth and Richard created. This wasn't a fleeting fling. This was an obsession, a love so consuming it nearly destroyed them both. They married, divorced, remarried, and divorced again. Each chapter of their saga left behind headlines of excess, jealousy, and heartbreak. In a world that worshipped at the altar of glamour, their union was both a blessing and a curse. To the public, they were fascinating proof that passion could burn brighter than reason. But behind closed doors, their love story was tearing them apart. What began as a forbidden romance soon morphed into one of Hollywood's most toxic love stories, a scandal that would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were more than actors. They were the architects of their own legend, a tale of love, lust, diamonds, and destruction. And like any great Hollywood epic, their story had everything: desire, betrayal, spectacle, and tragedy. Before the world saw them as a scandalous pair, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were individuals shaped by vastly different beginnings. Two people whose upbringing seemed destined to collide in fire and passion. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was born in 1,932 inches London to American parents. Her father was an art dealer, her mother a retired actress. From the beginning, Elizabeth seemed almost otherworldly. Her violet eyes, framed by double eyelashes, would later become her trademark. When World War II broke out, the Taylor family moved to Los Angeles, and with them came a little girl who would soon become one of Hollywood's most mesmerizing stars. Elizabeth's rise to fame was rapid. At just 10 years old, she was cast in Lassie Come Home, 1943, and by 12, her role in National Velvet, 1944, had made her a household name. Hollywood fell in love with her beauty and poise, but Elizabeth wasn't just a pretty face. She had resilience, charisma, and a stubborn streak that made her stand out in an industry that often chewed up and spat out child stars. By the time she was in her 20s, she was already an icon, but also a woman scarred by tragedy. Her third husband, producer Mike Todd, had died in a plane crash in 1958, leaving her widowed at just 26. This early brush with loss, combined with the constant pressures of fame, made Elizabeth a complex figure, both fragile and ferociously strong. She craved love, craved passion, and craved a partner who could match her intensity. Richard Burton's beginnings, however, could not have been more different. Born Richard Walter Jenkins, Jr. in 1,925 inches Pontrydyffryn, a small coal mining village in South Wales, his childhood was steeped in poverty and hardship. His father was a miner with a taste for alcohol. His mother died when Richard was just 2, and he was raised largely by his sister and her husband. Yet, From this bleak upbringing came a remarkable gift. Burton possessed a voice that could shake a room deep, resonant, commanding. Teachers noticed his talent early, and with the help of a mentor, Philip Burton, whose name he later adopted, Richard pursued acting. After serving in the Royal Air Force during World War II, he returned to the stage and quickly became known as one of Britain's greatest theatrical talents. His Shakespearean performances in London earned him critical acclaim, and Hollywood soon came calling. By the early 1950 seconds, Burton was rising fast in film, starring in titles like My Cousin Rachel, 1952, and The Robe, 1953. He brought a brooding intensity to the screen that audiences found irresistible. Still, off-screen, he wrestled with demons, his working-class insecurities, his heavy drinking, and his volatile temper. When Elizabeth and Richard finally met years later, these backgrounds collided. Elizabeth, the polished Hollywood beauty who had known luxury from childhood, and Richard, the rugged Welshman who had clawed his way out of poverty, were opposites in every way. Yet that contrast was precisely what made their eventual romance so combustible. Elizabeth had been groomed by Hollywood to be adored, pursued, and worshipped, but she longed for authenticity. Richard, despite his fame, still carried the rawness of his Welsh roots, a man who was passionate, poetic, and flawed. He could challenge her, argue with her, match her wit and her fire. At the same time, both shared a hunger for more than ordinary love. They craved drama, intensity, and the kind of connection that consumed everything else. Their upbringings had taught them that life could be cruel and fleeting. Elizabeth, scarred by widowhood at a young age, understood loss. Richard, raised in hardship, understood survival. Together, these lessons would fuel a relationship built on extremes, ecstasy, and agony in equal measure. By the early 1960 seconds, Elizabeth Taylor was already the highest-paid actress in Hollywood, with multiple Oscars on her shelf, while Richard Burton was at the height of his Shakespearean fame, conquering both the stage and screen. Each was a star in their own right, commanding respect and attention wherever they went. But neither was prepared for what would happen when fate placed them together on a set that would become one of the most notorious productions in film history, Cleopatra. It was there, in the heat of the Egyptian sun and under the glaring eyes of cameras and gossip columnists, that their paths converged into one scandalous, unforgettable story. The year was 1961, and 20th Century Fox was embarking on what would become the most expensive film ever made at that time, Cleopatra. Elizabeth Taylor had already been cast in the title role, making her the highest-paid actress in Hollywood history. For the part, she negotiated a staggering $1 million contract, a record-breaking fee that only cemented her reputation as the Queen of Hollywood. Richard Burton, though already a respected actor with a formidable Shakespearean background, was not yet considered on par with Taylor in terms of international fame. But when he was cast as Mark Antony, the man who would spar, flirt, and fall in love with Cleopatra on screen, the stage was set not just for cinematic history, but for one of the greatest scandals the world would ever witness. From the very first rehearsals, sparks were undeniable. Elizabeth, dazzling in her Cleopatra costumes, carried herself with the kind of confidence that could silence a room. Richard, intense and magnetic, was her equal in every sense. Both were married Elizabeth to Eddie Fisher, whom she had controversially married after the death of her beloved third husband, Mike Todd. Eddie had left singer Debbie Reynolds to be with Elizabeth, and that scandal was still fresh in the public's mind. Burton, meanwhile, was married to Sybil Williams, his wife of over a decade, with whom he had 2 daughters. On paper, their affair should never have happened, but Hollywood is rarely a place for restraint, and Cleopatra was no ordinary film. The production was plagued with delays, extravagant cost, and constant reshoots. Elizabeth fell gravely ill during filming, requiring an emergency tracheotomy that nearly killed her. The press covered every twist and turn of the movie's chaotic progress, and soon they began whispering about something else: the growing closeness between Elizabeth and Richard. It began with stolen glances. Crew members later recalled that the two could barely keep their eyes off each other between takes. Richard, ever the charmer, would lean in with that booming voice and dry wit, making Elizabeth laugh even on her darkest days. Elizabeth, who had always surrounded herself with powerful men, found herself utterly captivated by Burton's combination of intellect, rugged masculinity, and Welsh poetry. Their chemistry became impossible to contain. Kisses rehearsed for the cameras lingered just a little too long. Caresses seemed just a little too real. Soon, everyone on set knew. The lines between Antony and Cleopatra, Burton and Taylor, had blurred beyond recognition. The paparazzi caught on quickly. Photographers snapped shots of them sharing intimate moments off set, and rumors exploded into headlines. By the time Cleopatra premiered in 1963, their affair was the talk of the world. The Vatican even condemned the relationship, calling it erotic vagrancy and a disgrace to the sanctity of marriage. But condemnation only made the public hungrier. The scandal was irresistible. Two married stars, larger than life, defying convention in the most glamorous and reckless way possible. Elizabeth and Richard didn't just have an affair, they fell headlong into obsession. Burton was known to arrive at Elizabeth's trailer carrying champagne in the morning, his voice booming down the halls as he demanded her attention. Elizabeth, in turn, showered him with affection, and later, with gifts so lavish, they became legendary. It wasn't just love, it was spectacle. Eddie Fisher, humiliated, tried to hold on to Elizabeth, but it was futile. She was gone, her heart captured by Burton in a way that no man before him had achieved. Burton's wife Sybil watched as her husband slipped further and further away, consumed by the magnetic pull of Elizabeth Taylor. By 1964, both marriages had collapsed, and Elizabeth and Richard married in a whirlwind ceremony in Montreal. Their wedding was less a celebration and more a coronation of Hollywood's most infamous couple. The press swarmed, the public gasped, and suddenly Liz and Dick were no longer just two actors, they were a global phenomenon. Every move they made was covered, every word scrutinized. Their love affair, born in scandal, became the centerpiece of popular culture. But from the beginning, cracks were already visible. The passion that had burned so brightly on the set of Cleopatra was not the steady glow of a quiet fire. It was a raging blaze that consumed everything in its path. They fought as intensely as they loved, with arguments that could shake walls and reconciliations that were just as dramatic. Still, in those early days, the world saw only the glamour. Elizabeth and Richard were the golden couple, draped in diamonds, lounging on yachts, kissing passionately on red carpets. They starred together in multiple films, from The VIPs to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, a movie that mirrored their turbulent reality and earned Elizabeth her second Academy Award. For a time, their story looked like the ultimate Hollywood fairy tale. Two stars who found each other against all odds, who laughed in the face of scandal and lived larger than life. Yet, as everyone would soon discover, fairy tales rarely survive when passion turns toxic. At first glance, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton seemed to have everything: fame, fortune, and a love story so intoxicating it had captivated the entire world. But beneath the glittering diamonds and champagne toasts, their marriage quickly spiraled into a battlefield of egos, addictions, and constant volatility. Their love had begun as a scandal, a blaze of passion that refused to be extinguished. Yet what no one realized was that this same fire would eventually consume them both. Elizabeth and Richard didn't do anything halfway. They loved furiously, fought ferociously, and indulged recklessly. Their relationship became the epitome of excess, lived entirely in extreme. One of the most defining features of their union was alcohol. Richard Burton had always been a heavy drinker, his Welsh roots steeped in pubs and whiskey, but fame and fortune only magnified his dependence. Elizabeth, though not as notorious for drinking before, joined him glass for glass. Together, they cultivated a lifestyle drenched in liquor. Champagne at breakfast, vodka at lunch, whiskey at dinner. Alcohol was as much a part of their daily lives as cameras and scripts. Friends and insiders later recalled how their home was filled with towering bottles of liquor, how parties would blur into arguments, and arguments into reconciliations that were just as fiery. Elizabeth once joked that their fights could break the sound barrier, but there was nothing funny about the destruction they left in their wake. Their children from previous marriages often witnessed these clashes, doors slamming, voices raised, accusations flying. Still, just as quickly as they erupted, they would fall back into each other's arms, intoxicated not only by alcohol but by the sheer gravity of their bond. Then came the diamonds. If alcohol was the fuel of their relationship, jewels were its currency. Burton lavished Elizabeth with some of the most famous gems in the world, each one a glittering symbol of his love and perhaps his guilt. The most iconic was the 33-carat Krupp diamond, followed by the legendary 69-carat Taylor Burton diamond, which became synonymous with Elizabeth's image. To the public, these gifts were proof of a love larger than life. But to those closer, they were also a bandage, a way for Burton to apologize for the pain his drinking, jealousy, or infidelity might have caused. Because beneath the passion, jealousy festered. Richard was wildly insecure despite his success. Elizabeth was one of the most beautiful and powerful women in the world, adored by millions, and Richard couldn't shake the fear that she might slip away. He accused her of flirting, of entertaining other men, and Elizabeth, fiery as ever, refused to bow to his suspicions. Their fights often revolved around control, who held power in the relationship, who could wound the other most deeply. Hollywood watched as the couple continued to work together in films that blurred the line between performance and reality. Their 1966 masterpiece, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, was almost too real. Elizabeth's portrayal of Martha, a bitter, drunken wife locked in psychological warfare with her husband George, played by Richard, was chilling because it felt authentic. Audiences couldn't help but wonder, were they acting or simply reenacting their own lives? The film earned Elizabeth her second Academy Award, while Richard, though nominated, walked away empty-handed. The contrast fueled further tension between them. Elizabeth, once dismissed as just a beautiful face, was now celebrated as one of the greatest actresses of her generation. Richard, despite his talent, often felt overshadowed not only by Elizabeth's fame but by the mythos that surrounded her. Yet, for all their dysfunction, they were inseparable. They divorced their spouses to be together, and now divorce seemed unthinkable, even as their marriage roared with turbulence. "We're stuck like Siamese twins," Elizabeth once said, "joined at the heart." And in many ways it was true. Neither could imagine a life without the other, no matter how destructive they became. By the early 1972, their excesses were beginning to catch up with them. Both were frequently hospitalized, Elizabeth for health crises brought on by drinking and exhaustion, Richard for alcohol-related ailments. Yet, even then, they clung to each other. When one collapsed, the other was at the bedside, vowing love all over again. Their relationship was a cycle: passion, indulgence, chaos, collapse, reconciliation. The press, of course, couldn't look away. Every fight, every hospital stay, every dazzling diamond made headlines. The world was addicted to Liz and Dick's drama, just as they were addicted to each other. They had become more than actors. They were tabloid royalty, their every move a performance for an insatiable audience. But no storm can rage forever. By the mid-1972, cracks in their union widened. The fights became more destructive, the reconciliations less satisfying. Burton's drinking worsened, his once brilliant career beginning to stumble under the weight of his addictions. Elizabeth, though still dazzling, grew weary. The woman who had once fought so fiercely for love began to question whether this love was worth the pain. For over a decade, they had lived a love story of extremes, a marriage that was both intoxicating and poisonous. It was the very definition of a toxic romance, one that drew strength from passion, but slowly eroded everything else: health, happiness, and peace. And soon, the world would watch as the inevitable unfolded, the breaking point that even diamonds and devotion could no longer mend. By the mid-1972, the cracks in Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's marriage had widened into chasms. What had once been a passionate, intoxicating love affair now resembled a war zone, one fueled by alcohol, jealousy, and years of festering wounds. For over a decade, they had dominated Hollywood headlines, their love story hailed as both a fairy tale and a cautionary tale. But the breaking point was inevitable, and when it came, it was as spectacular as their rise. The signs were there long before the final explosion. Richard's drinking had spiraled out of control. He was consuming bottles of vodka and whiskey daily, often stumbling through sets or lashing out at friends and family. Elizabeth, never one to back down, matched him drink for drink, her health deteriorating rapidly. The once golden couple now appeared bloated, exhausted, and worn down by years of excess. Their fights, which had always been legendary, reached new heights of cruelty. Insults cut deep, objects were hurled across rooms, and accusations of infidelity flew constantly. Elizabeth accused Richard of womanizing, pointing to his flirtations on film sets and his reputation as a ladies' man. Richard, in turn, accused Elizabeth of manipulating him, of using her beauty and fame to control every aspect of their lives. In private, their children often bore witness to these volcanic clashes, leaving lasting scars. Friends and colleagues who visited their homes reported feeling like intruders in a war they couldn't stop. One day, laughter and champagne would fill the air. The next, shouting and slammed doors rattled the walls. The scandal came to a head in 1974. After 10 years of marriage, Elizabeth and Richard announced their divorce. The world gasped. This was not just another Hollywood breakup, it was the end of an era, the shattering of a myth. For years, Liz and Dick had symbolized passion incarnate, and now that passion had destroyed them. But even in separation, their story refused to follow convention. Barely 16 months after their divorce was finalized, they shocked the world again. Elizabeth and Richard remarried in 1975. It was as if they couldn't resist the gravitational pull of their own obsession. "Maybe we belong together in hell," Elizabeth quipped at the time, a line that summed up the paradox of their relationship, unable to live without each other, yet incapable of living peacefully together. Their second marriage was even shorter and more volatile than the first. Old patterns resurfaced almost immediately: the drinking, the jealousy, the arguments. Elizabeth, desperate for stability, found herself worn down by the endless cycles of chaos. Richard, though still deeply in love with her, could not tame his demons. In 1976, just a year after their remarriage, they divorced again, this time for good. The scandal of their two divorces made headlines around the globe. It wasn't just about a couple breaking apart. It was about the disintegration of an empire. Together, they had been more than actors. They had been a phenomenon, a brand, a spectacle that fueled tabloids for over a decade. Their breakup wasn't merely gossip. It was cultural theater, watched by millions with fascination and disbelief. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of their breaking point was not the scandal itself, but the lingering love that refused to die. Even after their second divorce, Elizabeth and Richard continued to orbit each other's lives. They spoke on the phone, exchanged letters, and occasionally reunited in quiet moments away from the public eye. Richard once wrote that he would always love Elizabeth, calling her extraordinary, and confessing that no other woman could compare. The tragedy was that their love, while undeniable, was unsustainable. Too much damage had been done, too many wounds inflicted. They had given the world a love story for the ages, but at the cost of their own happiness. In 1984, Richard Burton died suddenly at the age of 58 from a cerebral hemorrhage. Elizabeth, upon hearing the news, was devastated. Despite years apart, she admitted that he was the love of her life, the man who had both completed and destroyed her. She even kept the letters he had written her, locked away as sacred mementos of a passion that had burned too brightly. Their breaking point wasn't just a divorce, it was the collapse of a myth, the end of one of Hollywood's greatest sagas. But it also cemented their place in history. No couple before or since has embodied such raw, volatile passion in the public eye. Their scandal wasn't just about adultery, diamonds, or drunken fights. It was about the dangerous allure of a love so powerful that it consumed everything in its path. Elizabeth and Richard's downfall was a reminder: the brighter the flame, the faster it burns. and theirs had burned hotter than any Hollywood romance before or after. The collapse of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's marriage did not just echo within the walls of their private lives. It reverberated through Hollywood, the media, and even the global stage. Their love affair had been a public performance from the very beginning, and their downfall became just as public, magnified by lawyers, gossip columnists, and a society hungry for the spectacle of two titans tearing each other apart. By the time of their first divorce in 1974, Elizabeth and Richard had amassed an empire of properties across Europe, yachts, priceless art, and of course, the famous jewels. Untangling their assets became a legal circus. Divorce settlements in Hollywood were nothing new, but with Liz and Dick, the scale was unprecedented. Every diamond, every painting, every villa became fodder for speculation. Who would get what, and how much would it cost? Elizabeth, ever the survivor, emerged with staggering wealth, including the jewels that had become synonymous with her image. The Taylor Burton diamond, in particular, symbolized both the extravagance and the tragedy of their union. Though Richard gifted it to her, the divorce settlement left it in her possession. When she later auctioned it, the sale price went to building a hospital in Botswana, a gesture that turned a relic of their toxic love into something enduring. But the legal fallout was only part of the story. Public backlash was brutal. For years, their relationship had been condemned by institutions as powerful as the Vatican, and now their divorce confirmed the suspicions of moral critics. This was not love, but indulgence, lust, and reckless obsession. Newspapers worldwide painted them as symbols of Hollywood excess, a cautionary tale of what happens when passion is unchecked. For Burton, the backlash was particularly cruel. His once illustrious career faltered in the aftermath. Though he continued to work, critics claimed his performances lacked the fire of his earlier years. His drinking grew worse, and the shadow of his relationship with Elizabeth hung over every role. Casting directors hesitated. Would audiences see Richard Burton, the actor, or Richard Burton, the scandal? Elizabeth, meanwhile, proved more resilient. Though her reputation was bruised, she had an uncanny ability to reinvent herself. Her celebrity remained untouchable. If anything, the scandal only enhanced her mystique. She leaned into her role as Hollywood's reigning queen, dazzling the press with her resilience, her diamonds, and her unabashed confidence. She was no stranger to controversy, and once again, she survived it. Yet survival came at a cost. Both Elizabeth and Richard struggled with the loneliness that followed their break. Their second marriage in 1975 seemed, for a moment, to be a chance at redemption, a defiant stand against public opinion. But when that too collapsed after only a year, the backlash intensified. Critics sneered. What had once been glamorous now looked pathetic. Two addicts trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape. The courts, the tabloids, and even former friends seemed to conspire in stripping away their myth. Instead of Hollywood royalty, Liz and Dick became caricatures, symbols of wasted talent, wasted money, wasted love. For every admirer who still saw their bond as legendary, there were skeptics who dismissed it as destructive spectacle. And yet, beneath the noise, something quieter endured. Letters later revealed that Richard wrote to Elizabeth, even after their final divorce, confessing his enduring love. Elizabeth kept those letters locked away, a private reminder that their story, though ruined in public, still lived in their hearts. When Richard died suddenly in 1984, Elizabeth's grief was palpable. The backlash, the legal battles, the divorces, none of it mattered in that moment. To her, he was still the love of her life, the man who had changed her forever. In later interviews, she admitted as much, her voice heavy with the weight of regret. In the years following his death, public opinion began to shift. What had once been mocked as scandal began to be reinterpreted as legend. Documentaries, books, and retrospectives painted Liz and Dick not just as tabloid fodder, but as tragic lovers, doomed by their own flaws. The backlash softened into fascination, the outrage into nostalgia. Their story, once condemned, became immortalized as one of Hollywood's greatest love sagas, because, in truth, the public had never really stopped watching, never really stopped caring. Even in their destruction, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton had given the world what it craved most, A story too grand, too tragic, too human to ever forget. In the end, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's story was never about happily ever after. It was about passion, unrelenting, intoxicating, destructive passion that refused to conform to Hollywood fairy tales or societal expectations. Their love was both their salvation and their undoing, and it left behind a legacy as dazzling and as flawed as the diamonds they exchanged. To this day, their saga remains one of the most captivating scandals in Hollywood history. It wasn't just that they defied the rules, or that they flaunted their affair despite condemnation from the Vatican and whispers from every corner of the world. It was that they did so unapologetically, as if daring society to look away. And of course, no one could. For Elizabeth, the relationship solidified her reputation as not just a star, but as a woman who lived entirely on her own terms. She was vilified, adored, envied, and criticized, but she was never ignored. Her ability to reinvent pain into power, to turn even the ugliest chapters of her life into legend, cemented her as one of Hollywood's eternal icons. For Richard, the story is more bittersweet. His immense talent was undeniable, his presence magnetic, but his demons often overshadowed his brilliance. The world remembers his booming voice, his Shakespearean gravitas, and his tortured love for Elizabeth. Yet his career, unlike hers, never fully recovered from the whirlwind of their scandal. His life ended too soon, his brilliance dimmed by the very excesses that defined their union. Together, they taught the world that love can be both a dream and a nightmare. Their relationship was a paradox. Two people who could not live without each other, yet could not live peacefully together. They were, in many ways, a mirror of the human condition, our deepest desires for connection, our weaknesses, our addictions, our longing for passion even when it destroys us. The public backlash, the diamonds, the screaming fights, the reconciliations, all of it has blurred into a single, unforgettable narrative. Today, when people speak of Hollywood's greatest scandals, Liz and Dick's names rise to the top, not because they were the worst of sinners, but because they were the most human of legends. Elizabeth would go on to marry again, but she never spoke of love with the same ferocity as she did of Richard. And Richard, even in his final years, confessed in letters and conversations that Elizabeth was the great love of his life. Their story did not end with a wedding or with a divorce decree. It ended with two hearts forever marked by each other, no matter how far apart they drifted. Perhaps that is why their saga endures. Because while scandals fade, true passion, however destructive, leaves an indelible mark. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were not just stars who burned brightly. They were a supernova, a cosmic explosion that dazzled the world and left behind a legend of love, lust, and loss that will never be forgotten.